Hello everyone, today we talk about 13th century Poland, state, society, the German settlement, the relation with the Teutonic Knights, the reunification attempts, the reigns of Przemysl the second and Backlab the second, and the general cultural accomplishment of the country for our very short introduction kind of historical region series. We already talked about 12th century Poland. We will go on. I naturally made lots more about Polish history in general, also for the Middle Ages. 13th century Polish infantry was, I remember, one of my earlier videos, so you will find this easily in the playlists and in the comments about the related videos. The picture of the country at this point is quite fascinating, because as you know, Poland was a monarchy. Of course, at least it was tendentially to be conceived as such, but not exactly a kingdom, right? There was a high dukedom, fundamentally, that corresponded to the control of Krakow, that was essentially the capital, the most important center of Poland at the time. And it was from the 11th century that the Poles did not have a king, right? A high duke, yes. But the PS dynasty that had maintained still control of the country through a dynastic, essentially princely system, very similar at this point. I made a video specifically on this to the one of the Kievan Rus. These two countries were quite similar at the time. The Poles would intervene, as you know, in Russian affairs. The Rus was much more of a central European country, culturally speaking, right before the Mongol invasions that in fact struck in this 13th century, also Poland, as you know. So we'll see this now in a while. But they had established a system for which of seniorate, right, for which who controlled actually the most important city of the realm would be recognized as a high ruler, as a prince, as the High Duke of Poland. Lots of other duchies that were again run by the various branches of the same PS dynasty. Today we will not digress on why Poland had developed like this. Of course, this was a pretty large country, and it was difficult, given the lack of a pre-existing state, let's say in the High Middle Ages, before, to concentrate power monarchically in the same fashion, for example, in which Bohemia, that was much smaller, also much more influenced by the Germans, succeeded in. Right, power was shared, and as we will see, Poland was able to grow in the meanwhile in a political institutional sense, in a dysfunctional way, at least in terms of unity of command, but still participating, aside from the disruptive Mongol invasions, to the substantial development of European civilization at this point, which transformed itself because of the combination of the two factors in a much more, say, insustated feudalism that, as you know, on the very longer run, right, until the 18th century, would prevent the establishment of a strong central power, and so leading practically the country to remain feudal in some nature and dissolve in front of the more modern centralized powers. Naturally, in the 13th century, they couldn't expect that, but surely it was a difficulty seen pretty much all across Central Europe, for reasons that I also explained in videos dedicated specifically to the comparison of these various, not just Slavic countries. Germany, in a sense, was the same, right? The national monarchy failed exactly in the 13th century as well, but mostly Poland, Bohemia, right, look like that. Eastern Europe was slightly different. So it was not in a better condition, actually, in terms of civil development, but also other things were going on. In any case, this is the picture we're looking at. We're not making an evenemential history of the various monarchs. At some point, we will cover in detail all this various progression, right? Here and there, you already find something about Polish history on Schwerpunkt of this kind. But the general picture, I think, is more important for these very short introductions. As we were pointing out, development is important because the 12th to 13th centuries, were a moment of great expansion of European demographics, agriculture, and so on. So this was a moment, as you know, especially in Western Europe, narrowly meant development of so-called feudal monarchies that had an important concentrating capacities. Right, when you let the system grow unchecked, basically things get messed up, and later it's ever more difficult to fix them. This in fact, the Westerners already knew, because it's what had happened after the Carolingian Empire, right? Central Europe had remained a bit more, loose, because they had essentially much less resources in the first to try to centralize in the first place. This is not to say that the Piast's power was not worth of praise. Also, in the establishment of a monarchy, by the way, from a strongly minority part of what would become Poland, but still to affirm themselves as the ruling dynasty, creating the seniorate system, etc. In any case, growth brings to much more forces agitating within the country, competing with one another, and so constant internal conflicts that brought to, that normally are important for a civilizational development, but that also must be contained by a civilization. In this case, the Piast dukes were unable to stabilize the very country's borders, right, at the expense of Polish land, that ended up under somebody else's control. Western Farther Pomerania in the north broke her political ties with Poland in the second half of the 12th century. And from 1231, she became a fief of the Margraviate of Brandenburg, which in 1307 extended its Pomeranian possessions even further east, taking over the Polish towns of Swabno and Słupsk. We've seen this in the video about the Margraviate of Brandenburg, by the way, as much as, in fact, the loss of Pomerelia, right, what is, historically known as either Eastern Pomerania, Vistula Pomerania, Polish Pomerania, but Dansk Pomerania, that became independent of the Polish dukes from 1227. Now, this is a great deal, because this area essentially of, like, you get the northwest, the northeast of Poland being gradually lost, together with the access to the Baltic Sea, right? The watershed of Poland from the Carpathians is fundamentally flowing, of course, towards the Baltic Sea, which means all trade, all export, in that great trade basin is precluded to the Piast dukes, right, that have at least to pay much higher taxes in order to trade, to pursue certain trade policies abroad in that direction. Needless to say, here the Germans are the ones that not only inherit this land feudally, but that are running the Baltic trade far and wide, right? So, as we will see now, this was becoming a problem as the Teutonic Order would settle also in these lands and create a, even though as a vassal of the Polish sovereign, a counter-state, or at least a state was competing with the Poles, and not just with the pagans that had been called to crush, and that they had somehow swiftly done, at least for some of them. And the importance of Polish access to the sea here is big, because since the foundation of Poland, the Piasts had pushed towards, especially Pomerania, that had been probably a distinct land, even from an ethnic point of view. These peoples had been out there also pretty much during the Viking era. They were more reluctant than others within the continent. They were in fact brought under by the Piasts to give up their own autonomy, in part also because they were somehow, well, it's a bit difficult to say, but generally speaking, this northern part, also in the east, was inhabited still by pagans for some time longer after the Christianization of Poland had been fully accomplished for good, right? So in the history of the country, in the history of Europe, the fact that Poland could not access the Baltic precluded, say, the Slavic power to emerge as a major, also maritime player in the air, for what, of course, sea-borne capacities were limited like at the time, but in a moment in which other powers, also non-really settled ones, think about the Hansa, right, that was just essentially a cluster of towns, right, so something that, of course, even other kingdoms had to be aware, especially from an economical point of view, trade point of view, but that also made their fortune with these lands, with these coastlines, and the role with the Scandinavians that had been launching their crusades in the Baltic, the same role of the Teutonic Knights. So it's difficult, of course, to pinpoint a time before or after which this would have been, more or less feasible, right, for Poland. But just we observed that the aforementioned political institutional system had somehow created problems for this. And it was also the consequence, naturally, of significant preconditions, again, of such a large country not having had, in early medieval times, anything like a state, practically. And so the effort of the Piasts is more, is more evident. We see in the mechanisms through which these lands were lost that often had implications for the competition of the various dukes, because if you were, let's say, a Silesian ruler like Boleslav the Bald, also known as the Horned, right, it would become High Duke, but that still fundamentally ruled from Silesia, that is a continental land. Well, you would grant some land, such as the Lubusz one, to the Margrave of Brandenburg, creating enemies within the same Poland. Those who had interest in those lands and counted on expanding their lay and ecclesiastical princes alike. Right, this decision by Boleslav in the mid-13th century would trigger essentially the creation of the Neumark, right, also known as the East Brandenburg, right, so there's a region that stretches east of the Oder River, right, so in the territory which became part of Poland in 1945, and so you understand the long-term implications of these mechanisms. Naturally, this was damaging for the entire system, right? Boleslav was doing that to capitalize upon his, say, position, his condition, and the opportunity of, say, having this short-term gain, right, in exchange, however, for a deterioration of the integrity, especially of the western border. As we will see now, the 13th century witnesses a very heavy process of Germanization in many areas of Poland, and of Germanization, I say, in Polish culture to an important degree. Silesia, for example, was very much, let's say, the northwest of Poland. We've seen it even in arms and armor videos. By the 13th century is now fully, like, you cannot distinguish. Look at the seal of Henry the Pious, right, that died at Legnica, in fact, together with the Germans, the Teutonic Knights, etc., against the Mongols, he looks like just he had as a full German panoply there, right? And say the southeast of Poland was a bit different, but as I often say, by the 13th century, especially the Western Slavic countries were fully, Westernized in fighting styles. Some more tribal primitive feature had survived up to that point. This doesn't mean that Polish feudalism was as advanced as the German one to this point, but the frontier area was pretty blurred in this regard. The same can be said for Bohemia, for other lands. By the way, I made a video about medieval Silesia that deals exactly with this. At the end of the day, mess, because this was destined to be a sort of Balkanized land, right? At some point, these rulers were to, by fighting against one another, had to separate even elements of the same individual duchies, not one of the greater Poland as a whole. It was, pretty clear how far this feudal dynastic disputes could reach, as far as the weakening of a central power was concerned. In the southeast, the Poles lost some opportunities as well. Leszek the White, the Prince of Sandomierz and High Duke of Poland, in this tormented time at the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century, also because of the Mongols, we will see it now, was unable to preserve Polish supremacy over the Alich area of the Rus. Right, the Rusian Palatinate. I made a video about the kingdom of Galicia, Volhynia, a territory that it was one of the most advanced. It was the fact that one of the richest, most developed areas of the Rus. The one naturally was also more western, more distant from the Golden Horde. That had, however, changed hands on a number of occasions. Right at this point, Russia had been struck by the Mongols that had severely undermined, compromised the hierarchy there and causing a collapse, right, of the system of the Kievan Rus, and other powers like Lithuania, like Poland, in fact, but also Hungary. We've seen this in multiple videos. Had tried to and the Mongols, of course, to control this land that still had a important political unity, but was searching now also for the protection of the papacy, even though they were Orthodox, etc. And gradually, as you know, this land would be incorporated in Poland in the later Middle Ages, in the especially the early modern age, right? Formally, at least part of it, and the problem here, Leszek is famous also because he was famously assassinated, was betrayed in the struggles within the same Polish rulers, and so on. But it shows some missed opportunities of which the Polish neighbors took advantage. Right, Lithuania, for example, was expanding far south. We talked often about the role of the Lithuanians in the 13th century, how they battled over Ruthenia against the Mongols and others, and were initially enemies of the Poles. We were essentially the same, and still at this point, the same pagans that launched raids into Poland, for which the Polish kings had called the Teutonic Knights, and only later they would essentially start siding with the same Poland against the same Germans, who were basically to wipe them out otherwise, right? But for example, the extension of Lithuanian power on an enormous area of Eastern Europe, just next to Poland, was very, very fast, right? And imagine it, you're still battling for trying to keep all the duchies of your realm together, right, as a chimera fundamentally, and all this stuff is happening, plus you're being invaded by the Mongols. Needless to say, And this is a characteristic that would remain in Central and Eastern Europe for a very long time. The social status was becoming increasingly based on the size of feudal land possessions, to the point that only the oligarchs would afford to rule, right? The populace, right? That was fundamentally depending on them, and not developing some more bourgeois kind of communities, institutions, and florid independent cities like in other parts of Europe. Right. Naturally, the rights of towns, etc., did exist. We will see it, especially the ones founded by the Germans, that were, in this sense, used to try to stem the power of the Polish oligarchy. Right. But the peasantry, the towns in Poland wouldn't otherwise have the power to withstand this nobiliar onslaught. And much of this order that essentially undermined, in fact, the further concentration of even of a monarchy power, was deeply seated exactly in this century, right? Because this was the time which Western powers were establishing, even with very different systems. Either it could be feudal monarchies or city-states or even the papacy, right, just per se, would create some statal profile, right, with a concentrated power, etc. In Central Europe at large, the nobility managed to retain their own private prerogatives, and transforming these countries into elective monarchies that depended just on these estates, and wouldn't make it to carry out more assertive policies and solid expansion. The Piasts, as princes of the various duchies, controlled obviously much land themselves. It was the only way, factually, to rise to power. It was true also in the West, of course. And their rivals were the great lay and landowners, church entities, also the knightly estate, by a degree, that all had their own prerogatives embedded, like in what was developing as a constitution of the country. It was based mostly on custom, right, and so reflecting the level of autonomy that these groups had. The workforce, labor power, ranged from hired, say, free people that de facto were losing their freedom, right, to serfs. That is what, in fact, most of the peasantry would actually, or de facto, become, at least, attached to the land, to slaves. Slaves were out there. These countries were on the frontiers to what pagan tribes, so at that point the Christians had much less scruples to turn these people in. Then with co-religionaries, we will see now the very harsh events occurring all across Poland for the wars were being fought, but just imagine what, say, these places were in the 13th century. I mean, the level of brutality, just the consideration of human life, just the basic, moral and material ratios, what they concretely were, right? The upper layer of the feudal lords, first the church and then the others, but the church was quite powerful, were able to acquire economic and legal immunities, which it exempt to a significant degree from court jurisdiction and economic obligations such as taxation that had previously been imposed by the ruling dukes when the Piasts had managed to rule, at least as kings of Poland. They really harvested these these privileges at this point. They molded them, they established and they saw them recognized. They became an object of trade with the Piasts. And this is how such substantial, say, islands, probably of oligarchic lordship, would be carved out within this pretty large territory that took on also some very irregular borders, by the way, because of all this, as we've seen, territorial losses, just directions of expansion, etc. So the most violent issues in Poland at the time were civil strife and foreign invasions, right? The former caused by just this perpetual conflictual state, but the latter especially at the hands of the Mongols. That in there I made multiple videos, as you know, about Mongol warfare, also probably about the invasion of Europe. I profusely discussed all the implications of this, and as you know, the first invasion of Poland occurs in 1240-41, culminating in the Battle of Legnica, where the Mongols defeated an alliance which included forces from this fragmented Poland and their allies, led by Henry II the Pious, the Duke of Silesia. This invasion was really disastrous. We know also archaeologically speaking that many structures were destroyed. We find literally some layer of ashes and rubble, and after that, properly Polish mindset is completely redrawn by the experience. They start building heavily fortified centers in with a much greater availability of stone, just because, of course, there would be a bouncing back also of the economy at some point, but with a much more defensivistic and further entrenched, fortified mentality. The country is run across, right? There is no stop, right? That at this point the Poles managed to impose the Mongols. Legnica was the most important stand, which also entailed a German participation, because the Mongols also entered Germany. Technically, at that point, we're just passing by for securing their flank for the invasion of Hungary. It was also pretty devastating, the defeat of the Hungarian army as well. And while Hungary recovered from an institutional point of view in the later century, Poland had a bit more difficulties, right? We have in 1259, 1260 another invasion that hits the cities of Sandomierz, Krakow, the same capital, Lublin, Zawichost, and Bytom. They're sacked by the Mongols, and it's only in the third Mongol invasion of the country, 1287-88, that the Poles manage to defeat in open field near Goslich the Mongols, in a context, by the way, which of course waters had calmed regarding especially the Mongol strategic projection capabilities, manpower, etc., because it was now just being territorialized and regionalized in the Golden Horde. But even though the Mongol capacities to invade Poland had evidently decreased, it was also about the Mongol capacity to mingle into Polish affairs, right? To come to the help of this noble against this other, etc. Evidently, the Poles here have scored a civilizational hit. They are indeed, the Mongol invasions, as destructive, they brought to some political cohesion. The metus hostilis not so strongly pronounced. Actually, the Piasts are keeping to fight each other bloodily. But of course, Poland goes on, right? There is a moment of reconstruction, of reordering. There is a further, there's a period now of colonization, right? As the small principalities were weakened and depopulated, and the country was becoming gradually more subdivided, the population and increasing demand for labor caused a massive immigration of West European peasants into Poland. Most of these were Germans, right? The early waves from Germany and Flanders occurred in the 20s of the century. And this process that, of course, mostly entailed Western Poland, even though, as you know, the Ostsiedlung scattered pretty far and wide across different lands, but also in Bohemia, etc. So also in areas where the Germans had already been present in part, and where the boundaries, as we've seen, were not so strictly defined of the Slavic world. The German and Polish and other new rural settlements represented a form of feudal tenancy, right, that also received legal immunity by especially the PS themselves, that saw this foreign immigration as a way to solve fundamentally some of the problems of, say, especially stemming the oligarchic forces. Right? There are the German town laws that, or German communal concerns, that were often used as legal basis for saying, look, this, because the Germans were well organized. They were, of course, maintaining some contact with the fatherland. They settled in areas where, of course, this was not a Far East, right? There were also some conventions and negotiations. So by establishing certain rights that were becoming standard, think about the Magdeburg ones, in say in the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, also in the Hansa, so areas that were all around Poland, would stick together. They would maintain their cohesion and objectively represent some wedges within this great oligarchic systems. The Polish rulers had used, like, to stiffen the town's economy and capacity, Jewish settlers, right after the destruction of the Khazars at the end of Rus, for example. You know that many of those were Turks were converted to Judaism, and a great part of Central Europe saw the rise of towns and mercantile activities, because the Jews were the ones who legally were, accepted to lend money against Christian law, etc. So it was just an escamotage for especially the rulers to create especially stronger urban communities that could oppose themselves to these great landowners, right, and obliging them to frequent those markets that, however, would have this very specific rights. The Germans pushed that further, right? German immigrants were also important in the rise of the same Polish cities, not just the German ones. They, in fact, brought to the establishment of the Polish burgher, city-dwelling merchant estates by imitation. Also because they contributed to activate further Polish economy, and so their model was emulated by some merchants that claimed certain prerogatives for themselves and were not so dangerous as the feudal nobility. Right? We mentioned the Magdeburg rights. We can see the Germans also creating their own hierarchy within the mercantile world, with the patricians that were the wealthy burghers fundamentally. You see them in the urban centers of Silesia and other regions of Western Poland the most. right? And they were an increasingly influential minority in Poland that could be used by the Piasts to control, to manage better internal as much as also in external affairs. Because the Germans had connections with a larger net, right? So, of course, there would be fierce, say, rivalries within the same German communities as notorious. I mean, just look at as the answer was practically separated into 4 chunks that every once in a while they made war against one another, etc. But being part of that network still meant, say, a broader reach, a greater influence. And so it's as if you were pumping blood in this system on top of the general expansion that this a substantially agricultural land. I made a video about 14th century Polish economy that observes how things had, in fact, have been growing from the 13th century, of course, and that were beginning to specialize, right, to export, to build, right. Also, at that point, something would be established as a state, because the monarchy, as you know, was reintroduced the following century. Actually, at the end of the 13th. Now, in 1228, the Acts of Chania were passed and signed into by Vladislav III Spindleshanks, right, of the Piast dynasty, was the Duke of Greater Poland, High Duke of Poland, and Duke of Krakow during the intermittently, say, telling all the dates is a bit of a mess, but say from the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century. The titular Duke of Poland had promised to provide, in this case, quote, a just and noble law according to the council of bishops and barons. Right, so these were the legal guarantees and privileges we were talking about, including, interestingly enough, some lower levels of the population. Right, so medium landowners and knights who were evolving into the lower and middle nobility estate, the gentry fundamentally, later known as the Schlachta. That would be overall responsible for that sort of gripping of the Polish monarchy, but at this point, interestingly enough, was recognized also in some substantially lower echelons of society for a monarchic wish, because recognizing the rights of the oligarchs was important. But if you still recognize also the ones of, say, some other smaller landowners, knights that by the 13th century were increasing in importance, there were some colonists already. There were some German knights settling already, being used by the Piasts and so on. Well, all these people could, of course, represent a bulwark also against oligarchic expansion that could trample their own rights otherwise. So it would have not made sense to be so restrictive at that point to the distribution of such rights, because the big deal is was now that the oligarchs simply, from the strength of their own possessions that they already own, right, claim those rights, and these acts were fundamentally still giving a chance to the lower estates that, however, were already suffering of the situation. So that on the longer run, in fact, this Schlachta would be, in fact, a much higher community by status and socially than these original groups, right? But still, right, the prestige of people who bore arms were still free, was not, let's say, a matter of, to kid about, because there was traditionally no difference between freemen, right? So the moment in which your own freedom was recognized, this entailed that whoever was technically free, or even de jure, so not even de facto, because as we've seen, many of these people were tied by clientery connections to the most powerful, but you would be careful not to, say, create a fracture that would have been, say, juridically speaking, possible to establish at the time, because on which base you could, say, create further castes, right, aside from the ones that already existed in tradition, right? Either you were freeman or you weren't, and at this point the thing was seen mostly in, say, juridical terms, so also in terms of inheritance or of somebody's status, right? Then the serfs and the slaves were something else. And of course, the nobility had more prerogatives, but in virtue of arrangements that had been contracted between freemen, right? So even though lots of freemen lose consistently their freedom, de facto, still de jure they are represented. This was very useful for the monarchy. Relations with the Teutonic Knights are crucial here too, because aside from the social strife, there is a major political territorial issue. In 1226, the Duke Conrad I of Mazovia, so we are in the far northeast of Poland, at the border with the Baltics, with the pagan Baltics, invited the Teutonic Knights that had been established in the Holy Land and had tried to go for their expansionistic adventures in Hungary before the local king kicked them out after they had, in fact, seized too much and had not wanted to give it back to the king, by the way, to help him fight the pagan Baltic Old Prussians, who lived in a territory just adjacent, in fact, to Mazovia. Substantial border warfare was taking place already, skirmishes. It was always the deal, right? The Poles had the upper hand, but not enough at that point to be strategically decisive. The Prussians were pretty warlike. They were limited in capacities, were poor, they were primitive, but they could launch raids and destabilize at least the local economy, like the political events. So the Mazovia was suffering from this situation. The Old Prussians themselves were, of course, without many options, because the Crusaders, Polish, German alike, were subjecting them to increasing force, and with very scarce results of Christianization, so that often the only alternative was death. Right, the Northern Crusades were carried out by the Scandinavians that had turned, say, from their Viking activities into these ones, because essentially the former masked by the latter, sponsored by the papacy, and as such, it was understood that the Baltic, as primitive, as pagan, was at least now a land that the Westerners had enough capacity to put at work and to colonize profitably. So the Poles were, generally speaking, interested in the same, right? It was a general sense of the interest, saying that even the pride, the prestige and the participation of the Crusades and the Baltic that were being established at this point. Polish Bohemian rulers did participate to this stuff, except the Teutonic Order soon overstepped their authority and moved beyond the area granted them by Conrad. We're talking about Chelmno and the Kulmer land, so territories that were still reinforcing essentially that distance of Polish rulers from the Baltic, so cutting them ever more into a continental and relatively isolated position, right? Consider that the Mongol invasions had destabilized Eastern Europe to some advantage eventually of, say, the Lithuanians, the Poles to interfere in Russian affairs. But there were the Mongols from the other side, and Germany was, even though it was very feudally messy and turning even more so, it was still like a large gluing blob that was somehow now pushing in towards the same Poland, etc. So, and from the north now with the Teutonic Knights, so that Poland began to feel squeezed, and so this was yet another factor that brought to an internal consolidation aimed at contrasting the Teutonic Knights, because they understood they would have been choked, right? Not that differently from how the Lithuanians were feeling on the other side. This is what brought eventually to the bond between Poland and Lithuania. By the way, consider that the Duke of Mazovia had enfeoffed these knights, and legally this meant that they were subjects of the Polish monarchy, right? So this complicated the situation because it was evident that the Teutonics wanted to remain free. They had also some imperial privileges. They were a monastic state that succeeding, as you know, in conquering large areas along the Baltic Sea coast and consolidating one of the most advanced centralized states of the time. So surely not looking forward to obey anyone in that privileged situation. But feudal law was pretty clear, right? So that the Polish monarchs had definitely the cards to play to claim overlordship, and when they realized that the Teutonic Knights were not just willing to play their game, war was de facto the only option, right? The Teutonic Knights, as you know, were pretty efficient, right? Virtually all of the Western Baltic pagans became converted or exterminated, right? The Teutonic Knights were not exactly people provided with, visible trace of human, mercy, which, is objectively useless when you want to accomplish these things. The Prussian conquests, for example, were completed by 1283. Like, the Prussians literally disappeared. Like, they weren't all slaughtered, but virtually so. The Teutonic Knights would, in those lands, you see, that's what I was telling you before. Just try to imagine what, like, the Baltic lands were in the 13th century. I mean, the primitive savagery that you can imagine, it's undescribable, right? So those are places where you can literally do whatever the hell you want. If you want to rape, if you want to chop people to pieces, if you want. That's also what the others do, interestingly enough. Teutonic Knights were roasted alive. We know that, this cute little things that the Lithuanians do, right? That still burn themselves with war horses and making sacrifices of slaves, etc. That's the tender and cute mindset of these funny guys, after all. And in any case, that's the point, right? Crude German steel and, rivers of blood and constant guerrilla from the other side. The fact that, aside from the river mouths that were the ones from which all these slaves, amber, lots of other goods, wood, say timber, furs, etc., would arrive, the interland was not so appealing because objectively there is nothing. Literally, right? These places do not have cities, they do not have anything, right? But that's exactly the worst place where you that you have to cope with if Wu leaves there start harassing you, as always. And I described Lithuanian warfare at some point, that was really backwards in many ways. I mean, Poland was light years ahead compared to that by medieval standards. And so as we're saying, in this international sense, that these two somehow different countries, Central and Eastern European, Christian and a pagan one, right? Lithuania also had some Orthodox influences, but as you know, would convert to Catholicism, because at some point they thought they would unite with the Rus, say that even the Muscovy at some point. Things went otherwise, but of course it was a relentless work. Now we don't have time to digress. We talk after all just about the 13th century, but the Teutonic Wars with Poland and Lithuania continued for most of the 14th and 15th century. Before, after Tannenberg especially, the Teutonic reigns were broken by the joint effort of the Allies. But by the 13th century, the Teutonic state, that was, by the way, increasingly populated by German settlers since the beginning of the century, albeit maintaining a majority Baltic population, was a giant, right? And plus protected by the popes, by the Holy Roman emperors, that especially the latter would be very supportive. The popes were mostly looking for converting the entire country, so they weren't looking favorably on wars between Christians in the first place, so that there would be other games that even facilitated the Polish-Lithuanian action later. But say it was very complicated to dislodge these monastic warriors from Polish land. This began in the early 13th century, which prompted, among all the other problems that we listed, the devastation of the Mongols. So this precarious situation that was exposing Polish weakness to some attempts of reunification of the kingdom. This is how it normally happens, civilization. Everybody says, it's not so bad after all. Then eventually there's a collapse and say, okay, let's do the thing that we didn't do before, even though we perfectly knew it was the one that needed to be done, right? And there were different attempts. Let's say, of course, the PS interest was always to achieve this unification because they had the numbers, the blood, meaning that they were dynastically recognized. It was objectively, there were other, as we'll see now, other elements, but say that a bit like there were rickets in Rus, the Piasts, in Poland, the Przemyślids in Bohemia always maintained their first place, right? There was an attempt, especially by the Silesian Piasts, such as Henry I, the Bearded, to carry out this progress, right? His son Henry the Pious, the one killed in 1241 while fighting the Mongols at the Lenitsa, was also a great proponent. This, as you understand, were some of the most powerful Piasts, the ones ruling the most westernized, modernized in that sense lands, the ones resenting also more of German culture and feudalism, but in a monarchic direction. Henry IV the Probus, the son of Henry III the White, these are also Silesians. In 1295, at the end of the century, you have a Przemysl II of Greater Poland, that also ruled on Krakow, on Gdansk, Pomerania, depending on the years here, became the first Piast Duke crowned as King of Poland since Boleslav II, centuries before. And the claim is very important, because even though Przemysl ruled over only a part of the territory of Poland, including, we've seen Gdansk, Pomerania from 1294, so even part of the territory had been previously lost, and was assassinated soon after his coronation, by the way. The concept, right now, by the end of the 13th century, given the international situation, the accomplishment of the monarchy, the victory over the Mongols, that was evidently a big deal of a moral achievement, also for probably the Polish confidence at that point as major military players, reflects the necessity of statehood, of monarchy, of expansion, right, of claiming back what had been lost. A more extensive unification of Poland was accomplished by a foreign ruler, that is Backlab II of Bohemia, a Przemyslid, who was also in fact Duke of Krakow from 1291 and King of the same Poland from 1300, both until his death, and who had married the daughter of the aforementioned Przemysl II of Poland, Rykedza, Elizabeth Rykedza of Poland. This obviously had conferred him some further dynastic and blood rights. In any case, he was a foreigner. Vaclav was very heavy-handed politically, and this caused him to lose whatever support he had early in his reign. What happened is that the Polish nobility said, well, okay, we can maybe call this guy just to, manage the situation, like trying to avoid this reinforcements of the Piasts, right? So it was still a pretty troubled situation, which things could take a different direction. But these rulers, say this elective policy of some sort that, as we were saying before, would somehow characterize these kingdoms in later Middle Ages, because Poland, as you know, would eventually call the Jagiellonians. I mean, that's for another time, but we've already seen it. Was based on the concept that yes, for the nobility, things would be easier in theory. Because they wouldn't have a more locally entrenched ruler, even though this guy had seized Krakow as well. That was, in fact, the most important city, and that's also how he could rule in the first place. But was still ruler of Bohemia. That wasn't faring even particularly well, right? They had recovered after the defeat at the hands of the Habsburgs, the loss of southeastern Germany that they had managed to seize during the interregnum. But obviously, the Przemyslids would, first of all, they were very entrenched in Bohemia, right? They didn't see themselves in more than other dynasties like venturing around. So obviously, when they installed themselves in Poland, they say, okay, well, let's take as much as we can, because that was the actual point. Like if you have, like in the later Middle Ages, like a single guy that is the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Poland, the King of Hungary, whatever, and Bohemia, it can't put all this wealth, right, from all these various countries together and just concentrate it in his preferred one, the one in which he is based. Naturally, it becomes more like there are different degrees by which you can do this policy. In this case, it seemed like a good opportunity, just that wouldn't probably come back soon. Take a lot of stuff, bring it to Bohemia, and then just see what happens, right? He died in 1305, so he didn't rule for too long, but it was evident in here that there was no, say, enormous benefit cooperatively with the nobility, with foreign rulers. And in fact, the Piasts will come back in the 14th century. Will be eventually again the aforementioned Angevin, Jagiellonian passage, but that still was grafted on a more solid system than the one we witnessed during the 13th century. Still elective, but still more institutionalized, more state-like, etc. There was a very important factor, as always, that had played also in the other countries monarchic compaction. That is to say, the support of the Polish Church. This, say, as we've seen, the Church was also opposed to, say, not to the monarchic prerogatives, but at least they wanted something on their own. the church, for many reasons, had remained a single ecclesiastical province throughout the fragmentation period, and that's why it had remained so powerful. This is typical also of other states. You can even argue that the Teutonic Knights, as a monastic state, had been blessed with the similar thing. They didn't have to split the inheritance. There was still a feudalism going on, but say once a grand master or a bishop died, you just replaced them, and power continuity would institutionally remain. And the church had understood that, of course, the opportunity of living in a strong Polish monarchy was quite advantageous to them. Especially the famous Archbishop Jakub Swinka of Gniezno was an ardent supporter of Poland's monarchic reunification. Right, this figure is very important, telling the truth. His lifespans between the 13th and the 14th century, and later on, in fact, would be quite instrumental to the monarchic policy in different ways, because troubles didn't end. But this guy would surely descended from the local nobility, and that has this name that is Swinka because, and you can see it. There's a picture here in the coat of arms. It was the one of a wild pig's head, right? That you can't avoid to notice sounds dramatically close to swine. And this is, in fact, another German loan of the many that Polish had during this time, right? Especially in military stuff, pigs breeding, of course, was historically much of a German thing, well, also a Polish one for that matter, but say that sense of also colonization, farming, was investing Polish culture through the same words, names, and symbols, etc. There's plenty of this. I made a video about the 13th century Polish. One of the videos about 13th century Polish warfare explaining this, were many more names derived from German, and especially in the military language. And so you can see, as we'll see now also with the cultural development of the country, how there is an intelligentsia that is working, of course, that is understanding the enormous potential that this country has. Right, and so Jakub would perform the crowning ceremonies for both Przemysl II, Wenceslaus II. Swinka supported Vladislav the First, the elbow high, right, also known as Ladislaus the Short, that would rule ahead in the early 14th century, at various stages of the Duke's career, by the way, because he wasn't yet a monarch at some point. So we understand a collective effort to make things work more functionally, more unitarily. And culturally speaking, you can't think of Poland as, say, backwards in a way. Again, it didn't have the same urban development of other countries. It was largely agricultural world, a feudal one in which the Szlachta was basically taking over most things. You can't see this exotic Mongol, presence that turns the area in a frontier throughout the 13th century. But often in times of crisis, things develop. Like, as we've seen, minds activate. There is an effort to solve problems, to look towards the beyond. Right. The church was really important during the 13th century. There were networks of parishes established and cathedral-type schools spreading. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, made lots of videos about them, as you know, were sent by the papacy. At least were blessed by the papacy, but were expanding on their own with this specific missionary function of, one side, fighting the heresies that were rampant at that point, and let's say content in, let's say providing with a model of Christomimesis that, however, would be compatible with the nascent bourgeoisie, and especially in the cities where wealth was being accumulated, and it was unprecedented especially for these countries in history, so presented with new moral problems and so on. The Dominicans and the Franciscans were also quite useful to actually check the power of bishops, so the Piasts exploited this in part because bishops here represented the church, of course, under a positive light, because it overall was, but Polish bishops very often were not different from like others, like think about the German ones, etc., from powerful lay lords, right? They were warlike as well, so they played their cards as major landowners that would defend their own prerogatives. There is, however, a secular church, let's say, in her institutions, in the dioceses, the archdioceses, etc., that operated in that that higher institutional level, right? So this was also a link between the elite and the general population. There is an increase, of course, in literacy. A proliferation of narrative annals characterizes the Polish 13th century, as well as other written records, laws, and documents being issued, as we've seen. There is a need to make things work administratively, bureaucratically. So if you want that more concentrated power, you must regulate it. You must create educated personnel, clerks. There is at this point also a rise of native Poles in the clergy, right? At least proportionally, they start constituting a bulkier part, and then a more widespread, organized one, which naturally promotes a sense of national awareness, if anything, because they are the ones who can write, and they do so by doing it from a Polish perspective now. So compared to before, where times were much more primitive and less, let's say, intellectual, at least to a literary degree. So there was also the use of course, of Polish spreading to unprecedented levels, also the same administration. This is obvious, right? Generally speaking, the non-Roman countries passed to native vernacular much quicker, right? Because they were less used to Latin in the first place, and so at some point there would have been a barrier to continue with that, even though, of course, Latin remained the official language of the documents, of laws, and so on. The most famous chronicle of the period is the one by Vincenti Cadelbeck, a prelate and professed Cistercian who served, by the way, as the Bishop of Krakow from 1208 until his resignation in 1218, so definitely not a common clergyman, but still, rising through the ranks. We're talking about the Chronica seu originale regum et principum Polonia, so known more simply as the Chronica Polonorum, so the Chronicle of the Poles. It is a Latin history of Poland, written, in fact, between 1109 and 1208. This work was likely commissioned, by the way, by the ruler, right, Casimir II, right, the lesser Polish Duke of Wyszlica, right, and Sandomierz. In 4 books, it talks about Polish history, and of course, like some chronicles of the time, it adds somehow a bit of mix of history, allegiance. It talks about Julius Caesar and other events of early medieval Poland, such as the history of Princess Wanda, the daughter of Krakus, the legendary founder of Krakow, right? That would have allegedly become, upon her father's death, the Queen of the Poles. There's a fascinating say sources to read, to quote, whatever. Also because there are some of, say, there's not a dramatic amount of sources like these specifically, right? So these are, at least it's the pinnacle of it. So the information remains precious for the overall level of documentation of the country compared to others, especially in southwestern Europe. There is also a scientific advancement. Vitello, Polish friar, theologian, natural philosopher from Silesia, composed a treatise on optics known as perspective, of course. That is one of the peak achievements of medieval science that, as you know, in optics advanced substantially from antiquity. And so, well, you find it in this context. Poland is evidently at this point fully within the sphere of the broader, say, Western, what had been, say, the legacy of the Frankish world. Right now, it belongs fully to that world. 13th century, as we've seen, is this moment of great compaction of, say, also Polish and German synergy, hybrid, and competition even. So you would expect this going on. And architectonically speaking, we have beautiful churches and castles in the Gothic architecture. It was dominating Europe at this point. And you know that in order to build the magnificent Gothic cathedrals that, in fact, you can see in the pictures, right, in the Polish skyline, you do need a substantially concentrated amount of wealth, truly a feudal society that evidently was there, a rich church, and also powerful rulers. So that perhaps in this video we double down on the concept of political fragmentation, but it really was, because these rulers did have the potential to compact things, but it's exactly because of these resources that the thing is complicated and different political solutions are experimented, time is lost, others profit of that. So this is crucial because the time lost won't be recovered that easily, right? There is, as you know, something foundational in 13th century history, because the 14th century crisis would... Actually, the 14th century crisis was gentle on Poland, right? Poland actually was spared from most of the Black Death. In fact, that's when I made a video about that period of Polish economy, where they also started booming in terms of agricultural production, exported abroad, things like that. But generally, mostly from a political point of view, the sense is that the peak, right, of European civilization is the 13th, and after the 14th, in spite of this, say, temporary advantages, the ancien regime is established with no many capacities to change this throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages, modern era, right? So what could be, say, as the French would comment, le jeu sont faits. And while, say, certain European monarchies would also suffer the blow, etc., but they were more prepared, right? Instead, we're talking about countries like France, mainly. There were some, let's say, statal powers in Spain and in England, in Italy, in part, let's say. There is a state to some degree everywhere, right? So everybody restarted from that, but surely those who had more before were much more advantaged, and that's why, still things would go differently from most of this era in later times. In any case, I was glad to address 13th century Polish history. We will surely come back on it. as we have already done today from the past, we will surely space across all the various possible, like politics, warfare, society. There is really a lot to say about Poland. In any case, for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.